Well, we come now to the third lecture of our course, Paradise Lost in Slow Motion, hosted by the Antrim Literature Project, a public humanities platform that is dedicated to making the study of literature accessible to readers beyond the paywalls of the university. And I'm joined here over Zoom this evening with students of the course. It's so wonderful. We have a very diverse course in terms of time zones. And we have some people who are zooming in at 4 in the morning. And so it's really a treat to be, and some people very late at night. It's a real treat to be gathered with people who are so dedicated to learning this book and to experiencing it together in community. As we begin book 3, with Satan's alliterations and the chimes of hell still ringing in our ears, the poet begins with a ceremonial address to the holy light of heaven. The dramatic change in scene is kind of prepared for it by this invocation. We remember from book 1 the alliterations of "Hail horrors, hail infernal world," Satan's alliterations there. But if you notice the hinge, open your book to book 3 and just look across the page to how book 2 ends with that uh, weary description of Satan. Accursed, and in a cursed hour he hies. Christopher Ricks has noted beautifully how those panting and breathless vows of Satan hieing his way through chaos and into nature gives way to the full voiced syllables at the start of book 3. Hail, holy light. You notice how the pronunciation of those long vowels engages the whole mouth in a way that the previous 3, how he hide, are strained. And this is a part of how poetry is meant to be experienced bodily in a way. So before we begin our lecture, let me read to you this ceremonial address of the poet. I want to read this aloud. You might think of this as an archway into a completely new garden of poetry. We've moved beyond the striking and diabolical bromeliads of hell and chaos, and now we're climbing a promontory, we're climbing a path up to a promontory of heavenly blooms full of amaranths. And we encountered the first invocation at the beginning of book 1. It was in lecture 0. I discussed that. Now we come to another invocation, a more personal one rich in philosophy, theology, and his poetics. So for this, close your eyes. I don't want you to, or at least don't read the passage as I go along. For those of you watching on YouTube, do not listen to this on double speed. You can speed it back up when I start speaking because that's not important. But for Milton, give him the courtesy of hearing his words as they were meant to be heard. Remember, this is slow reading Paradise Lost. This is not the news hour. So the poet is disclosing his heart to us and revealing something personal, something new, something important. So I'm going to turn my camera off. That was my mic. There's my camera. Allow yourself to feel the textures of sound, to be carried along with the rhythms of the lines, and allow the illusions to pass you by equally, whether regarded or unrecognized. Take a deep breath and clear your mind, and I'll begin. Hail, holy light, offspring of heaven firstborn, for of the eternal, co-eternal being may I express thee unblamed. Since God is light, and never but inapproached light dwelt from eternity, dwelt then in thee, bright effluence of bright essence increate. Or hear'st thou rather pure ethereal stream, whose fountain who shall tell? Before the sun, before the heavens thou wert, and at the voice of God, as with a mantle didst invest the rising world of waters dark and deep, one from the void and formless infinite. Thee I revisit now with bolder wing, escaped the Stygian pool, though long detained in that obscure sojourn, while in my flight, though utter, and through middle darkness borne, with other notes than to the Orphean lyre I sung of chaos and eternal night, taught by the heavenly muse to venture down the dark descent, and up to reascend, though hard and rare. Thee I revisit safe, and fill thy sovereign vital lamp. But thou revisit'st not these eyes that roll in vain to find thy piercing ray, and find no dawn. So thick a drop serene hath quenched their orbs, or dim suffusion veiled. Yet not the more cease I to wonder where the muses haunt clear spring, or shady grove, or sunny hill, smit with the love of sacred song. But chief thee, Zion, and the flowery brooks beneath that wash thy hallowed feet, and warbling flow, nightly I visit, nor sometimes forget those other two equalled with me in fate. So were I equalled with them in renown, blind Thamyris and blind Maeonides, and Tiresias and Phineus, prophets old. Then feed on thoughts that voluntary move harmonious numbers, as the wakeful bird sings darkling, in the shadiest covert hid tunes her nocturnal note. Thus with the year seasons return, but not to me returns day, or the sweet approach of even or morn, or sight of vernal bloom, or summer's rose, or flocks, or herds, or human face divine. A cloud instead, and ever-during dark surrounds me, from the cheerful ways of men cut off. And for the book of knowledge fair presented, with a universal blank of nature's works to me expunged and raised, and wisdom at one entrance quite shut out. So much the rather, thou celestial light, shine inward, and the mind through all her powers irradiate. There plant eyes, all mist from thence purge and disperse, that I may see and tell of things invisible to mortal sight. Notice the architecture of illusion in what we just heard. He very much casts the role of himself into various figures. First, the role of the poet, shared by this allusion to Orpheus and his lyre. The poet described by Ovid, who descended into Hades with his lyre to sing to the king and queen of the underworld, and returned to earth by way of a steep passage. And then as Thamyris, who challenged the nine muses in a song and lost, and they took his eyes. Also with Maeonides, who is Homer. That's the surname of Homer, who was also blind, you may not know. So he's in good company here. He's reminding us. And then he adds himself into the company of Tiresias and Phineus, putting on the mantle of the prophet. And then as a visionary seer, and this is what's interesting, because as a visionary seer, Milton's blind, of course, but his physical blindness serves to augment the visionary capacity. So much the rather thou, celestial light, shine inward, that I may tell of things invisible. Then finally, as a songbird. I love that. Sings darkling, as a songbird in the night, as a wakeful bird sings darkling, and in shadiest covered hid tunes her nocturnal note. And when Percy Bysshe Shelley writes in his Defense of Poetry, the Romantic, that a poet is a nightingale who sits in darkness to cheer its own solitude, when he says that, he has the prophet poet Milton in mind, um, as he does when he says that poets are the unacknowledged legislatures of the world, considering Moses, the lawgiver, as a poet prophet, along with Milton in his own respect. So our attention turns now to the throne of God in heaven, Milton's God, I should say. And I want to recall the twofold purpose of Paradise Lost told to us by the poet himself at the beginning of Book 1. Two things, remember what they were? To pursue things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme, and then the other to assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. And he's doing that in this book. He's doing both of those things. He wants to make a unique literary contribution and to explain, even exonerate God's ways to us. Now, what happens in heaven has largely to do with the second aim. He wants to explain God's ways to human beings, but how is an aesthetic problem. Aesthetics is the philosophy of appreciating beauty and art. So anyone who's an artist has to think about their own aesthetics. What's their philosophy? What principles are underlying their composition? And the depiction, the dramatization that takes place in heaven of this volunteer, of this asking for a volunteer to take on the atonement, is an aesthetic dilemma that Milton has to wrestle with. So Milton's aesthetic dilemma involves dramatizing this rescue plan, the Christian salvation story, in an interesting way. So this involves what scholars have called the dramatic problem of Book 3. The dramatic problem is the problem of poetic representation. How do you represent something that wasn't even described in Scripture? It's the problem of making a judicial oration of the Godhead in a noble and an interesting subject of poetry, while at the same time being reverent as a Christian. Now, it's interesting that his allusions were not Christian prophets, because I think that would have verged on irreverence for him. They were classical references all, but now we're moving in as though to remind ourselves, or as though to remind us what genre he's in, the epic he's going to launch into this passage. In this dramatization. So I want to read for you the first words of God the Father that we hear in heaven after he's describing Satan. And it's very interesting to look at Satan through the eyes of God, the way the poet is describing the vantage point of heaven and the prospect of all below. God foresees the fall of humanity. So let's go to let's start at lines 93. Let me pull up my text here. And this is him halfway through the speech, or part way through the speech. It's not quite half. This is him describing, I'm going to read you the first few words. This is God foreseeing the fall of humanity, which needs justification, as we'll see. If he sees it, why did he not prevent it? Is the theological dilemma here. This is God the Father saying, for man will hearken to his glozing lies, speaking of Satan, and easily transgress the sole command, sole pledge of his obedience. So will fall he and his faithless progeny. Whose fault? And this is the central question of this passage. Whose fault is it that humanity fell? Because if God foreknew all things and is all-powerful, why would God not stop the fall that he foresaw? This was a central question that was enduring during Milton's day, and the mid to late 17th century is both the high watermark and also the late stage of English Calvinism. And during the Puritan interregnum, when England ruled without a king, many other interpretations of Christian doctrine sprung up, including those who questioned whether God was just in allowing Adam and Eve to fall. And Milton addresses this in his Areopagitica. We read a passage of Areopagitica last week, but I just want to bring your attention to this other one. Many there be that complain of the divine providence for suffering Adam to transgress, or allowing Adam to transgress. Foolish tongues! When God gave him reason, he gave him freedom to choose, for reason is but choosing. He had been else a mere artificial Adam, such an Adam as he is in the motions, like a puppet. We ourselves esteem not of that obedience or love or gift, which is of force, meaning we don't want a gift from somebody if it's not freely given. And so obedience is the same way. And so partly what Milton here is trying to do is to uh, somewhat, perhaps tediously describe and exonerate God from this perceived fault. It's interesting. We talked about Horace in the lecture on Latins. Horace, he has this famous twofold purpose of poetry: to teach and delight. And that seems to encapsulate Milton's idea here too. It's this didactic purpose, this teaching purpose, but it's also to do it in an interesting way that captures the imagination. But we're still with this teaching purpose, and I'm going to move on to the aesthetic principles that are underlying this passage. But let's stay here with the didactic aims. He moves on. Whose fault? Whose but his own, speaking of Adam. Ingrate, he had of me all he could have. I made him just and right, sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. Notice how this is going to come up again and again, and how it's linked to the faculty of reason. Such I created in the ethereal powers, and spirits, both them who stood and them who failed, freely they stood who stood, and fell who fell, speaking of the angels. Not free, what proof? Not free, what proof could they have given sincere of true allegiance, constant faith, or love, where only what they needs must do appeared, nor what they would? What praise could they receive? Again, free allegiance, true allegiance, looking for the proof. How are creatures praised in their obedience? They must be free, Milton is saying. I just want to move down a little bit further here, and all of this is it's really regal, judicial language, beautiful and sometimes musical, but we're gonna move down. For I foreknew. Here's the problem he's stressing. Foreknowledge had no influence on their fault, which had no less proved certain unforeknown. So without least impulse or shadow of fate, or aught by me immutably foreseen, they trespass, authors or authorities, authors to themselves in all, both what they judge and what they choose, for so I formed them free, and free they must remain until they enthrall themselves or enslave themselves. Now, the problem of freedom is that once they've given themselves over to Satan and they fall, they are no longer free, but are slaves of sin, according to the New Testament passages here that Milton is building into this poem, and that I think is really imported into it by the readers of his day. I else must change their nature and revoke the high degree, unchangeable, eternal, which ordained their freedom. They themselves ordained their fall. So God gave them freedom. They chose slavery. And he's talking about it as though it's already happened. So there's this temporal change. I think the idea is clear here. Don't need to dwell too much on this aspect. Humanity was created free, a state of freedom permitted by a perfect faculty of reason. The freedom of humanity is really the fault of their fall. Apparently, the Father thought that the fall was worth the trouble if it meant that humanity's love for him was genuine. and that he demonstrated it, and she demonstrated it by abstaining from the fruit. And the fruit of the forbidden tree is the sign or pledge of humankind's love or devotion. They abstain from the fruit, and that's the pledge or proof of their allegiance, as Milton says it. And this freedom of Adam and Eve is something that he talks about in his theological work, De Doctrina Christiana. Milton says that obedience is bound up with the freedom of the will. The idea of free will is repeated in Raphael's book, or in Raphael's discourse in Book 5, which we're going to get to. But he basically repeats the same idea here. The angels had a happy state, and their obedience held so long as they freely had it. And they freely love, just as humans do, Raphael explains. But that's in Book 5, once we meet Raphael. We're getting ahead of ourselves. So let's go back to see what happens when God falls silent. It's a beautiful phrase here, description. Sensuous. Thus, while God spake, ambrosial fragrance filled all heaven, and in the blessed spirits elect, sense of new joy ineffable diffused. Beyond compare the Son of God was seen most glorious. In him all his Father shone substantially expressed, and in his face divine compassion visibly appeared. Love without end and without measure grace, which uttering thus he to his Father spake. And note the musical nature of this. It's so charming, and he's trying to present it in a beautiful way. Notice the rhyme of face and grace, and then the assonance there of this long A and spake. This beautiful chiasmus too, another note by Christopher Ricks who makes mention of this. Love without end, without measure, grace. It's just an example of beautiful artistry of words here. And this brings us from Milton's purpose of justifying the ways of God to men, which is going to continue, to what I want to talk about now, which is the dramatic representation of something in poetry, of an interesting thing in poetry. I mean, this poem is a poem, and we sometimes need to be reminded of that, especially if we read a lot of prose. Now, what follows, you remember, is a dramatization of the plan of rescue. God, we learn, has determined that humankind shall find grace. Now, how that's going to happen is what the council needs to find out. And you'll remember what occurs in the Council of Heaven. The plan of rescue is not one of open war, but of legal satisfaction, of penalty paid. It's judicial language. So we talked about schemes of balance in lecture 1. And I just want to, we did a great close reading where we were talking about even discussion, the balancing of opposites, of similarities, of parallelism. But this also happens on a grand narrative scale. So just keep that in mind. Satan, in his mimicry of God's foreknowledge, had stacked the council of devils in favor of a solitary expedition, or at least through his mouthpiece, Beelzebub. And the Father here in his foreknowledge is shown to freely offer the plan of rescue to humankind. And here's how it must happen. The problem is that God is omnipotent, but he must play by the rules of nature that he has ordained. He must redeem humankind, not by magic, but by divine justice. And here's the problem as expressed by the Father. We're going to begin at line 203. So I skipped over some lines of the Son. Here we are with the Father. The Son basically asks, how man shall find grace? The Father answers, but yet all is not done. Man disobeying, disloyal, breaks his fealty, and sins against the high supremacy of heaven, affecting Godhead. Affecting here means to put on airs. That means he's presuming to be the Godhead, which is, we'll see in the fall, that's the way Satan tempts Eve. Affecting Godhead, and so losing all, to expiate his treason hath not left, but to destruction sacred and devout. He with his whole posterity must die. Die he, or justice must. Here's the judicial dilemma. God can't just grant mercy because he has to follow the laws of, he has to follow the law, the legal procedures that was laid out. You shall not eat of the fruit, the day thereof ye shall die. So he must die. So in order for mercy to take place, it must happen through justice, unless for him some other able and as willing pay the rigid satisfaction, death for death, say heavenly powers. Where shall we find such love? Which of ye will be mortal to redeem man's mortal crime, and just the unjust to save? Dwells in all heaven charity so dear? Again, notice the striking legal terms. We're now getting to the problem of the aesthetic representation of theological truths. To give you a sense of this aesthetic dilemma, let me show you how the doctrine of, we're talking about salvation, talking about atonement, of legal satisfaction. Let me show you an example of 17th century discourse on this topic. It's articulated in the most legal and precise terms in the Westminster Confession of Faith. And yeah, here it is, 1647. This is something that Milton knew well, a document he knew well. And let me just read you the first sentence. Christ, by his obedience and death, did fully discharge the debt of all those who are thus justified, and did make a proper, real, and full satisfaction to his Father's justice in their behalf. He goes on explaining how this, but it's so lapidary, it's so precise, this judicial prose. And it's saying in legal terms that there must be legal satisfaction. If the judge is to be both just and merciful, the law must be paid. And this is how most 17th century English people, indeed most Protestants throughout the centuries, have related to God through these legal terms. In fact, the entire Christian story, systematic theology for Protestants, revolves around the axis of this legal justification. And I want to remind us that while we're reading John Milton's Paradise Lost, we are reading verse poetry, which operates differently from prose. Those of us who spend a lot of time reading novels, most of what we consume is prose, we need this reminder. And one of the enchantments of poetry is its ability to present common objects in uncommon light. The Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky, in his essay Art as Technique, calls this activity, calls it defamiliarization. It's taking something out of context or turning it in a new way and giving us the sensation of experiencing it again for the first time. For Shklovsky, art has the power to raise old things out of their dusty corners and into the light of day. It's like when you're spring cleaning, and it's at the end of February, and once it gets warmer, we might do this, but usually you move all your furniture outdoors and you clean along the walls and the corners and all of that. But the furniture outdoors looks very funny. The tables and chairs looking out of place on the sunny lawn. It's sort of like that. Here's the passage from Shklovsky. And what I want to drive home here is that this old truth, this very central truth regarding atonement, which to us may be very fresh, was old hat for a lot of Protestants in England. And so the trick was to turn it in a new way. And so this is what Shklovsky says in his essay, Art as Technique. Love this. Habitualization. Habitualization devours work, clothes, furniture, one's wife, and the fear of war. If the whole complex lives of many people go on unconsciously, then such lives are as if they had never been. And art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived, not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty in length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. Love, this is an excellent essay, by the way. If anyone wants to look it up, I think you can find it for free online. Beautiful essay. I love that idea. The length of perception. People often complain that poetry is, why can't they just say what they want to say? Well, part of it is they want it to be a slow burner, a slow release of truth and experience. And so sometimes the complex syntax or language produces this effect. In other words, it's the slowing down of the process of perception. You look at new ideas, old ideas in slow motion, in new ways. Oh, awesome. Nick found a PDF online for us in the chat. Thank you, Nick. Brilliant. Check that out. Love that essay. Um, and this, I think, is what Milton is trying to do for us in this depiction of theology. And it's something that some readers may miss. So when you hear the silence in heaven linger after that question, when he asks, who in heaven would do this? Can such charity be found? You really begin to feel how close we are to not having any redemption whatsoever. He asked, but all the heavenly choir stood mute, and silence was in heaven. On man's behalf, patron or intercessor, none appeared, much less that durst upon his own head draw the deadly forfeiture and ransom set. And now without redemption of man, and now without redemption, all mankind must have been lost, adjudged to hell, to death and hell by doom severe. Had not the Son of God, in whom the fullness dwells of love divine, his dearest meditation thus renewed. And here he speaks up. Father, thy word is past. Man shall find grace. And shall grace not find means that finds her way, the speediest of thy winged messengers, to visit all thy creatures, and to all comes unprevented, unimplored, unsought, happy for man, so coming. He her aid can never seek, once dead in sins and lost, atonement for himself, or offering meet, indebted and undone, hath none to bring. Behold me then, me for him, life for life I offer. On me let thine anger fall. Account me man. I for his sake will leave thy bosom, and this glory next to thee freely put off, and for him lastly die. Now, this whole scene, is this the way the Christian scriptures relate what happened in heaven? No, actually, they don't relate it. The council is not dramatized. This is a poetic fiction on part of the poet, but it is an important one. This is not a religious text. It's an epic. It's a work of art. And it seems to me that the success of this passage rests in its re-representation of a truth that had become common in the English mind and in English piety. And that there had to be this dramatization. It was really affecting to a lot of readers, this representation of heaven. And John Dryden, in his the the Hind and Panther, the Panther and the Hind, let me find it. The Hind and Panther, book 2, yeah, starting at 499. John Dryden, he knew Milton, or at least he met Milton, had conversations with Milton. He outlived Milton and went off on writing in the 18th century. He's one of the great poets who purified English diction, who raised up heroic poetry. Anyway, this is a religious text, The Hind and the Panther. And in it, Dryden was so taken by Milton's recreation or dramatization of this that he does it himself in heroic rhyming couplets. And this is his version. So when of old the Almighty Father sate in council to redeem our ruined state, millions of millions at a distance round, silent the sacred consistory crowned, to hear what mercy mixed with justice could propound. All prompt with eager pity to fulfill the full extent of their Creator's will. But when the stern conditions were declared, a mournful whisper through the host was heard, and the whole hierarchy with heads hung down submissively declined the ponderous proffered crown. Then, not till then, the eternal Son from high rose in the strength of all the deity, stood forth to accept the terms, and underwent a weight which all the frame of heaven had bent, nor he himself could bear, but as omnipotent. Now that last line, nor he himself could bear, but as omnipotent, actually makes this a little bit more theologically precise and orthodox than John Milton's representation himself. We get the feeling that in John Milton's version here, that if an angel or a seraph had said, "Oh, I'll go," that would have been sufficient. But John Dryden, there at the end, he says, "No, this is something that only the deity could do. Only God could absorb the wrath of God or the penalty of sin from God." And so this is negotiation. But it's good to note that this representation, aesthetic representation of this theological problem, has inspired more poetry and presented something new. Inspired piety a little bit, sure. Some people find their devotion warmed by this discourse. It leaves me a little cold, but it's good poetry. It's part of what's inspired it. The poetry throughout the centuries as well. This one event, which is singular and kind of strange. So we're going to move into discussion, but I want to share with people on YouTube what will be our prompt today. I'm aiming to be as balanced as possible despite my own critical prejudices and how I'm reading the poem. I want you to take an honest look at your own responses to this book when you read that scene. Think back, how did it strike you? Because there are some problems with it people have noticed, especially for us contemporary readers. The scholar Dennis Danielson said this about it, just to give you a taste of what some critics are saying. The most obvious problem that results from this scene is that of anthropomorphism, of God sounding like a human being vociferously defending his own actions. Such a context thus makes it very difficult for us not to feel the same skepticism regarding this speaker's motivations that we would feel in any analogous human situation. It seems like God is a little too quick to justify himself. So there are two responses to God, readers' responses to God, that I think are really good, both by excellent critics who have different judgments about the representation of Milton's God. And the first is C.S. Lewis, an Anglican Christian, and he writes, Milton's representation of God the Father has always been felt to be unsatisfactory. Many of those who say they dislike Milton's God only mean that they dislike God. To many it seems that the failure, even if it is only a partial failure, of Milton's God destroys Paradise Lost as a religious poem. And I think it is quite true that in some very important senses it is not a religious poem. We are invited for the time being to look at the cosmic story from the outside. And that is not in itself a religious exercise. No doubt, the drawing of the face of God, or the depiction of God he's speaking of, might be so bad that we could not get over it. And similarly, Milton's God might be so bad as to spoil the whole pattern of which he is the center. But I do not think he is as bad, or even nearly as bad as that. And I took quotations from the longer essay here and stitched them together. Hopefully they give you a good sense of what Lewis is talking about and why he feels it important to address why many readers have not enjoyed the discourses of God the Father. They seem calculated. They seem a little too judicious and cold compared to the warm rhetoric of Satan. So enchanting. Okay, so that's one view. Here's William Empson. Totally different response here. And he's responding to C.S. Lewis. Professor C.S. Lewis let in some much needed air by saying many of those who say they dislike Milton's God only mean that they dislike God. Ibsen goes on. I think the traditional God of Christianity very wicked, and have done so since I was at school, where nearly all of my little playmates thought the same. Milton is struggling to make his God appear less wicked, as he tells us he will at the start, in Book 1, line 25, and does succeed in making him noticeably less wicked than the traditional Christian one. Hence, I also expect that most of the attackers would find their minds at rest if they took one step further and adopted the manly and appreciative attitude of Blake and Shelley, who said that the reason why the poem is so good is that it makes God so bad. Two really interesting judgments here, and both really great readers of Milton. So, we're going to discuss and maybe even debate and share our responses here. Do we think they're fair? Do we think they're off? How did we, as in our innocent encounters with this text, think of Milton's God and the whole depiction in heaven, especially since we're just coming off the books of hell? All right, everyone, thanks for joining. Next week, we will discuss Book 4, in which Satan discovers Earth. We also get a lovely picture of how, according to Milton, human life should be lived. And I think it's just a glorious picture. And so we're in for a treat, a specifically earthly treat from the scenes of hell and heaven. We now go into Earth. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And until next week.